I'm going to talk about writing as a technology. I'm also going to talk about scientific fraud, which is actually not very depressing either. It's really quite interesting. We're going to start this with getting you talking. I have some questions here. Those of you in the back corners, if you're taking this class, move to the front so you can talk to other people. I want you to talk about possible answers to those questions. So how do you see writing as being a tool or a type of technology? What do you use writing to accomplish in your life, personal and professional? In what ways can writing be hazardous or even dangerous? And also I want you to think about what's the relationship between writing and reality. So discuss amongst yourselves, and then we'll hear what you have to say. Hey, if I have to talk for the next hour, you guys can talk for a couple of minutes.
Am I supposed to be doing this right now? Okay, so we only got through really the first 2 points here. Most of us, I think, felt that writing is more of a tool than a technology. We feel that although the method of how we write may have changed and may have a technological aspect to it, the act of writing itself hasn't really changed much. We discussed the second point and felt that writing can be used to accomplish many different things, communication, or to spread your ideas to others, but also just to remember things or write down what you need at the grocery store or what you need to do tomorrow. That's how far we got.
Anyone have anything to add?
We did actually discuss that writing is a technology as well, that there's a substantial amount of data you can put into words. In English anyway, we have X number of letters, every single position. There's no limit to the length of each word, so we can actually encode a lot in our writing technologies, and that's actually quite fascinating. We talked about using writing to accomplish publishing, study, the different things that we do as academics, and that can tie into hazards around whether or not the information that's being put out there is actually based on anything, and whether those arguments are supported or even accurate. An additional layer we brought in is things around advocacy and putting forward positions and some of the hazards that can go with unsupported rhetoric being used and getting people emotionally involved without necessarily having any of that predicated upon a factual grounding. And then we just were briefly starting to touch on writing in reality as that helping shape how we perceive the world changes a lot by the kinds of writings that were going on. And we didn't discuss this, but the example I thought of was how our language in North America became very science-y oriented. When we saw the space race come in, we suddenly saw a lot of sort of Air Force / astronaut type language being suddenly used by people at large that hadn't previously been done. That's one example.
Very good. Very good ideas. I'm going to talk a little bit about writing as a technology. Here's a brief overview. I'm going to cover a brief history of writing as a technology. I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical links between writing and medicine, because they go back 2,500 years or so, I guess. Talk about how writing is the link between writing, medicine, and ideology. And I'm going to talk to you about a case study of writing's role in creating a disorder and the effects of scientific discourse on the general public and communities outside of the academy. And then I'm going to turn to talking a little bit about writing and scientific misconduct, and then look at what do the statistics tell us about the prevalence of cheating in science. Okay, so most people, if they haven't thought too hard about writing, they're kind of taken aback by the thought of writing being a technology, because generally we think of it as just a tool that we use. Some people think of it as kind of a transparent medium for thoughts, so you just write down the ideas that are in your head, and so it just is a conduit for you to communicate with other people. And scientists talk about writing up an experiment as if the experiment's already done, and you just write down what you found and communicate that to other people. Doctors also talk about writing up a patient's medical history. And those are definitely ways in which writing is used and thought about. But my question is always, is writing just an adjunct or a follow-up to real work? And of course, if I'm asking a rhetorical question like that, I guess the answer in my mind is no. There's problems with talking about writing like this because, in fact, it makes you think that writing should be easy. You should be able to get your ideas down, no problem. Other people should be able to read them, no problem. But when you actually undertake to write something complicated, it becomes a lot more challenging situation. And there's a bit of a problem with the way that we talk about it because it doesn't acknowledge the effort and thought that has to go into writing and the ways in which we use writing to actually figure out what we think or else to learn things. So reducing it to an adjunct to real work can really take you by surprise when you find out that it's actually a whole other order of work to transform into writing what you're thinking about. So to go back to ancient history, before we had alphabetic types of writing systems, there were pre-alphabetic syllabic writing systems. And such as Sumerian, which attempted to physically represent the syllables of the language that you heard. So it was useful for some types of communication, but it wasn't the kind of writing that would allow you to record thoughts or to think through an issue. They were too ambiguous to allow people to do that, and only specialists could actually use those written languages to do things, to keep track of crops and consumer goods and things like that. So the alphabetic writing systems came in with the Greeks. They developed a great technological innovation, which was to use written symbols to represent abstract units of language. So they didn't represent actual sounds so much as the phonemes, which are consonants, but you can't pronounce a consonant really. You always have to add a vowel to it for it to make a sound. So the beauty of these alphabetical writing systems is that they allow you to represent abstractly your ideas. So they're not recording speech, but they're allowing you to think and to record ideas. So people were able to write original texts using alphabetic type scripts, which before that they were not able to do this. So writing has a huge history as well when you connect it up with medicine. Many of the world's cultures preserved their knowledge of medicine and medical treatments by writing them down and preserving them in texts and on vellum and things like that. So the Egyptians, the Hebrews, ancient India, there's records of medical texts being preserved in writing. Many Islamic cultures preserved a lot of the important documents relating to medicine in their written texts as well. So they preserved their culture's medical knowledge as well as aspects of their culture's knowledge altogether, I suppose you might say. Writing was also an important part of education in medieval universities in Europe. So university graduates learned medicine from studying Greek and Islamic texts that had been translated into Latin. So they read Hippocrates, Galen, that whole group of people. That's how they learned, was by reading these preserved texts. Medicine itself was taught through a lot of discourse in that period, so mostly by lecture and disputation, which is debate and argument. So talking about medicine was the way that people learned. This was supplemented with actual practice and apprenticeship, and some dissection. Interestingly enough, not all of the faculties of medicine in Europe actually used surgery as a way to train students, so mostly it was theoretical knowledge they had, at least initially, and a lot of it came out of books. So interestingly, the quadrivium in medieval universities was made up of theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts. And that was kind of a graduate curriculum. The undergraduate curriculum was the trivium, which you started off, actually it's not even, it's even pre-undergraduate. You'd start off with grammar in elementary school, and then you would graduate to learning philosophy. And then the culmination of your language training would be in rhetoric, so that you could argue and present your ideas effectively. And then you would graduate from those into one of the branches of professional education at the university level. Now, this is an interesting example of the ways in which writing kind of codifies what we think of as knowledge. This is an illustration from Vesalius in 1560. He dissected 9 women in order to look at their internal organs and kind of map out what he saw there. And, you know, if you're familiar with actual female anatomy, it doesn't really look like this, but you will notice that he's drawn the veins so that number E, the blood vessel that feeds the left ovary originates in the renal artery, and it carries uncleansed blood, and then the right ovary is fed from the cleansed blood of the dorsal artery, which is number D. So what he's trying to illustrate there is visual proof of Aristotle's belief that female infants were generated from the uncleansed blood from the left ovaries, and males came from the right ovary, which had the cleansed blood. So Vesalius dissected women in order to find evidence to support the Aristotelian theory that men are more noble than women. And when he looked at it, he found what he was looking for. And he created an illustration of it that actually stuck around for a while. Interestingly enough, tradition is one of, and what his contemporaries thought they knew, what stood for scientific theory, was what he reproduced in his illustrations, even though it didn't actually link up with reality too effectively. But this is an example I see of writing creating an ideology that it's really hard for subsequent generations to break away from, because it really shapes what people see, why they see it, and it really raises the stakes for anyone who says, wait a minute, I don't see what you're seeing. So it's better just, especially if you're not a senior type of person in your field, to just be quiet, because that might not turn out well for you if you say, you know, the emperor has no clothes or something like that. So I see writing as really, it can contribute to these kinds of codifications of culture and ideology and knowledge. Whoops. Okay, this way. So I think this kind of summarizes what I just said. Writing can turn ideas into stone so that they become knowledge. They create permanent records. Whether they're correct or not, they are transmitted onto the next generation. It's up to people in the future to correct it, I guess. Culture, history, tradition, and convention can really turn to stone ideas, so that even reality has trouble dislodging those ideas, because we tend to cling to them. And in fact, Aristotle's science or ideology of human anatomy wasn't officially discredited for almost 2,000 years. That's a long time. Now I'm going to talk about a case study. This is based on Patty Kelly's work. It's an article called A Rhetorical Analysis of Premenstrual Dysphoric Disorder in Canadian Newspapers. And her study, what she did was analyze the newspaper coverage of premenstrual dysphoric disorder as they appeared in Canadian newspaper articles from 1986 to 2007. And so what she was looking at was the way in which the creation of a new mental disorder has political and social ramifications that go beyond the academic or professional world in which they're created. So she looked at 64 articles in 20 different magazines over 21 years. And what she found was the first article occurred in 1986 when it was proposed by the American Psychiatric Association to include premenstrual dysphoric disorder in the DSM number 3, I think it was, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So there was a lot of controversy about whether it should be included, whether it was a real disorder or not. And so that's when the debate began, and that's when she found the first newspaper article. So the newspapers were keeping track of what was going on in the academic discussions. So the originally premenstrual dysphoric disorder appeared in the appendix of the DSM in 1987. So it was kind of like something that was being talked about, argued over, whether it should be dropped from the book altogether or whether it should be moved into the main pages. And then the next time that the DSM was revised, in 1994, premenstrual dysphoric disorder appeared in both Appendix B and in the main part of the book itself. So it was under depressive disorders not otherwise specified, and an insurance code was assigned to it. And the point that she makes is that as soon as you assign an insurance code to any kind of a disorder, it gets diagnosed and then it becomes part of the medical establishment eventually anyways. So she also makes the point that the dual placement of PMDD occurred even though the subcommittee that was discussing this, they concluded that there was very little empirical evidence to support it being included at all. However, it appeared. So she was looking at the newspaper audiences or the newspaper articles to look at how mental illness or PMDD as a mental illness is constructed for general readers of a newspaper. And she was also looking at how the newspaper accommodates expert language and how that affects how women generally are, how women diagnosed with PMDD are regarded generally, but she also sees evidence that it kind of bleeds over into the larger population as well. So the fact that the disorder was classified at all kind of gives it a little bit more credibility within the psychiatric establishment. She argues that medical texts enact the values of biomedicine and facilitate the classification of persons ultimately, because that's what manuals do. They allow people to, perform their profession and also to have people treated and cured or not. And so she's looking at how PMDD became linked with discussions of premenstrual syndrome in the newspaper accounts. She saw this was a really interesting trend, that it didn't confine itself to a mental disorder, but when reporters started talking about it, it became something that was a little broader and more general than just a psychiatric disorder. So she found that the accounts suggested that any kind of premenstrual symptoms become indicative of a pathological state. And so a woman who has any kind of premenstrual symptoms becomes mentally disordered in the way that the articles construct these categories within newspapers, and then people reading them pick up on them as well. So what she found was that the diagnostic criteria that were set out in the manual, they become persuasive not just for professionals, but also for a broader audience than it was originally intended. So public audiences start to pick up that language as well and those ideas. So it's not really, the issue is never just a manual or just a description. It has broader ramifications. At the same time, the art of recording symptoms is an essential part of a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a physician's work. That's part of how you do your job. But it's interesting that a critical mass of recorded symptoms eventually can translate into an experience that becomes a disorder or an illness. And of course, I'm simplifying when I say that, but it's kind of interesting to think about. A little bit of shifting gears here to talk about writing as a technology in science, just briefly. This isn't going to be news to you, but writing establishes precedents for discoveries in science, right? It has to get to the editor first, it has to be published. And then the person who publishes the results first is the one credited with that discovery or that creation of new knowledge. When I was working at the National Institute for Nanotechnology, one of the researchers told me there that if you do the work but you don't publish it, you might as well not have done it at all. So you got to get it out there. Get it published, and then you get credit. Then it finally is done when other people know about it. Okay. Now I have a handout here. This is 2 case studies. I'm going to pass you a copy of them. I'd like you to read through them. And they deal with, one of them is medical fraud and the other one is scientific fraud. Oops. So there's some questions there. Read through and then discuss some of the answers to these questions in reference to this article. So if you're finished, you could move your chairs around and talk about answers to some of these questions. Talk about the cases. How do you see them as being different? What's significant about them?
So, isn't the title of the second study also kind of an issue? Because it suggests everybody in the country, all the universities and everybody working in those universities are suspect that if you want to do good science, you have to go to some other country. It seems an unusual. I mean, why would Nature pick a title like that? It seems that that's really a third issue here. We have these two misconduct by individuals and companies, but we have a kind of misconduct by the journal, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important point, I think. Why, you can see why they use the plural, because he collaborated with some people at other universities, but the headline itself looks as if everyone is doing it, and if you don't read the article, you could be left with that impression. So yeah, it's not just scientific misconduct we're talking about here, it's kind of journalistic misconduct as well.
Yes.
The way these things get characterized. What do you think? What did you, conclusions did you arrive at about these 2 cases? Is there anything interesting you want to share?
The 2 things, the similarity between 2 studies is, one is industry fraud and one is an academic fraud, but eventually it's harming the society. The company is there to make the money, like they put in money to get this drug out and they want to make the money. They don't care whether it works. It's robbing the people of the money as well as causing them harm. They're made to believe it works and it's not working really. And on the other hand, the difference would be, since companies, it's a monetary benefit for the companies. As far as academic fraud is concerned, it's to rise in the system, essentially, because in this culture of, you publish or perish, there's a rush to get out data faster ahead of anybody else. And so, of course, you're going to have unvalidated data out, which could be wrong in many cases, and that eventually harms the society, because it could be, you could have policies being made on that. Since it's I think it's a social psychology study, so you could have, government policies being made on that, which could eventually harm people, because based on wrong facts.
Yes. Good points.
Oh, and just maybe for the point on trustworthy, on the first report, it indicated there was interest from congressional members to have a hearing. So I'm not familiar with the publication that's reporting the article, but the types of people they're reporting that have concerns are people that we would presume to be credible in terms of investigating that. I'm less familiar with the one in Nature, except that it's my understanding Nature itself is considered a credible publication, so it would flag to me that it's probably a credible investigation.
Yeah. Yeah. Is anyone else, you were talking about the credibility of the website for the pharmaceutical company. Do you want to just recap for them what you were saying?
I'm familiar with the naturalnews.com website. The website tends to take quite a drastic perspective on the pharmaceutical industry and vaccines and things along that line. So I think you have to read this article with that in mind and know it's being written by someone with a certain perspective. And although I think they're addressing an important issue, I would prefer to read the article from several different sources, some of which might have a little bit more scientific credibility than this website.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and that's an important point, is who is making the charges of scientific misconduct and fraud, you know, whether or not they're credible sources, should you pay attention to them. I also thought it was interesting that this was the only source I could find that was discussing this issue, and the credibility is a bit of an issue here. So you have to, you know, you wonder, why is no one else talking about it? Is that because it's not really, it's a manufactured issue by this website, or is it there's something else going on here that it's of non-interest to other people working in those areas? So, and I don't know the answer to that, but those are the kinds of issues that it raises for me. Okay, I guess maybe I'll move on here to talk about, I did a bit of research on fraud in scientific and medical research. There's a bunch of really high-profile types of fraudulent people working who are revealed every once in a while. There was a chemist from India in 2008, and he was found to have plagiarized and or falsified more than 70 papers, and published in journals in 3 years. And I think he was uncovered, or his work was uncovered because somebody was reading one of his articles and they noticed that it was really similar to one that they had read previously by someone else, and it was exactly the same article, except instead of looking at germanium, it was looking at arsenic. And so they started, the people who found that started looking a little bit further, and then they found that the same paper had been published in multiple journals, and some of it was plagiarized and some of it was invented. So that was kind of embarrassing. Then the case that we just talked about here with Diederik Stapel. So you have more information. I don't need to elaborate that. This is an interesting one, fraud in cancer research. This group at Duke University, they actually published their article in 2006 in the New England Journal of Medicine. They were reporting that they could predict the course of patients' lung cancer using gene expression arrays, and then they were proposing that you could use these gene expression arrays to predict which chemo would be most effective to treat the particular cancer that the individual had. So it looked like it was a really exciting breakthrough in that you could tailor chemotherapy to the individual. So a number of people jumped on this discovery and tried to replicate it because they wanted to try to incorporate it into the treatments that they were making for people. But they found that they couldn't replicate the results of this study. And in fact, it didn't really go anywhere until 2010, when actually got this fraud was exposed because the Anil Pati had lied on his grant applications, and that's what got people's attention. He claimed to be a Rhodes Scholar in Australia, but if you're a Rhodes Scholar, you only can go to Oxford, so there was no such thing as a Rhodes Scholar in Australia, so somebody noticed that and started asking questions, and then that's how it came about. It wasn't necessarily because someone took on the fact that they couldn't replicate the group's results. There's also a really recent case of fraud in meteorology. So Mark Johnson, who's a meteorologist for this TV station in Cleveland, Ohio, published this graph on the newspaper, on the television in a news report, in which he showed this graph as claiming that it was showing the Earth cooling since 1998 rather than warming up, so refuting the whole global warming premise. And then Brad Johnson rebutted his claim, and to quote the second Brad Johnson of the first Mark Johnson, his nonsensical claim rests on the deliberate misinterpretation of temperature data. So, and this graph is the offending graph that was published and then criticized. So, you know, the whole global warming debate is so acrimonious in some places that people are skewing the data in order to represent one side or the other. This is a little bit older, the stem cell research fraud from 2005. A Korean group published patient-specific embryonic stem cells derived from human SCNT blastocysts, which was first published in Science. And the visual that I recreated was the table that people started to object to first. They couldn't replicate the information, and so they asked for, or they couldn't understand the information, I think, so they asked for a corrected version of it, and the group sent them a corrected version, but it wasn't a whole lot better than the first one. And then eventually I think they uncovered that they were using their own stem cells. The researchers were using their own stem cells to do the research, and some of the numbers were played with a little bit so that they weren't accurate. And there was a real fear that this fraudulent research set back stem cell research quite a bit because it tarnishes the whole field. It was the fear. This is another really interesting case of scientific misconduct, because you know, if you know anything about the autism vaccination controversy, it continues to this day with people still citing this study and citing this connection and acting as if it's legitimate scientific research when it turns out that it wasn't. But this article was first published in 1998. Ileal lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, it should be, that's a spelling mistake. Non-specific colitis and pervasive developmental disorder in children, so it was published in The Lancet. And what the Wakefield claimed was that the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine triggered autism in some children. So he was calling for an end to the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination. So researchers tried to replicate his findings, and they couldn't. So they asked him to withdraw his article, and he wouldn't. So ultimately, the Lancet retracted the article because he was still standing by it. But Brian Deere of the Sunday Times did an awful lot of investigative reporting, and what he found was that Wakefield was on the payroll of a group of people who were suing the manufacturers of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. And he'd also developed a competing vaccine that he was hoping he'd be able to replace the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine with in order to make some money, I guess. It turned out that he had carefully selected the 12 children in his study, and then he had altered the symptoms and data and diagnoses, etc., in order to show that symptoms of autism arose within 2 weeks of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. So there was quite egregious, really. So those are the most recent cases that I thought were interesting for various reasons. So what is scientific misconduct? Here's a definition. It's the violation of the standard codes of scholarly conduct and ethical behavior in professional scientific research. The key issue here is that it can't be misconduct unless it contains the intent to defraud. So the person doing the research has to knowingly and intentionally change the data or select the things they're studying in order to yield the results that they want. Unintentional errors is not scientific misconduct. It could be like stupidity or incompetence, but it's not fraud. And this definition is from Florence Colaciuono, and I found it on this website that has some interesting stuff about scientific research. So, lest we think that scientific fraud is a 21st or 20th century phenomenon, it actually does have a history. It goes back a ways. Isaac Newton himself may have adjusted his calculations to fit his observations. Gregor Mendel also got results that are a little too perfect, so it's been suggested that he might have made his data fit better. Robert Millikan has been described as perhaps eliminating some data points that didn't fit his curve very well, and Louis Pasteur as well has been, I guess it was determined that he said he used a vaccine against anthrax made by a competitor, but he was actually using his own vaccine. So there's a bit of a history here with various people doing things they perhaps in retrospect wish they hadn't. So how common is scientific fraud? That's the major question here. The Columbia University in the US, they have a website put out by the Office of Research Integrity, and some of their statistics I'm going to report here. They found that 0.14% of all grant recipients from people who got money from the National Science Foundation have been found to have committed fraud or misconduct. And that figure is actually 100 times lower than other studies show. And they suggested that what's likely happening is that institutions identify misconduct and they kind of like solve the problem and gloss over it. They're actually supposed to report it to the National Science Foundation when they identify it, but apparently a lot of institutions don't, because I suppose probably your likelihood as an institution of continuing to be funded is going to be directly related to how many of your scholars are found to have committed misconduct, so it's kind of brushed over a little bit. This website where I found the definition of scientific fraud, they suggest that for every case that's reported, there's probably as many as 10 cases that are unreported. And they were trying to account for why do people commit this kind of misconduct. And I don't know whether this is true or not, but they suggest that private research funding can encourage this kind of thing perhaps, and also acrimonious scientific debates can also cause exaggeration of findings as people are desperately trying to get funding. They also suggested that research tied to areas with mass appeal can also drive out pure or basic science, so that it doesn't get funded because funding is going to something else that's higher profile or more popular or something like that. So people tend to there's pressure for them to misreport their information sometimes in order to get funded or in order to demonstrate greater significance than they actually can so that they have a shot at funding. This is a scholarly study of scientific fraud. Danielle Finelli did a meta-analysis of a series of surveys of scientists asking them to self-report whether they had fabricated or falsified their data at any point. And this study revealed that 2% of scientists admitted that they had at some point fabricated, falsified, or modified data, at least once. And more than a third of them would admit to dropping data points or changing the design or results of a study in response to pressures from a funding source. So this is kind of interesting. So in these cases, they're talking about their own work. They were also asked whether they'd ever witnessed colleagues doing anything that was fabricating their data at all. And 14% reported that they had seen, they knew of colleagues who had falsified or fabricated data. 72% reported that they had seen other people use questionable practices in their research as well. An interesting outcome of this study was that Finelli noticed that the rate of self-reporting declined over time, but the rate of reporting about other people had not declined. It was holding fairly steady. So she concludes that training researchers in recognizing and dealing with scientific misconduct doesn't actually make the problem go away. And she said that these trends might suggest that scientists are no likely to commit misconduct or to report what they see their colleagues doing, but they have become less likely to admit it to themselves. So they will talk about other people, but they don't want to acknowledge their own failings in that area. So the next question I was asking about this is, so what are institutions and programs doing to try to limit the amount of misconduct and fraud that goes on? And the Office of Research Integrity notes that in 1995, the National Academy of Sciences told scientists that someone who's witnessed misconduct has an unmistaken obligation to act. So if you see anyone doing anything, you can't just turn a blind eye. You're obligated to do something about it. However, when the office looked further into, talked to whistleblowers who had exposed people who were doing fraudulent things, they found that people will only act depending upon whether or not their allegations are going to be taken seriously or not. If there's no repercussions or if they're not investigated, then people don't bother to respond or to report. And they noted that institutions should have policies in place that protect whistleblowers and keep the whole situation confidential. So I guess they talked to people who had exposed other people's misconduct, and they found that 2/3 of all whistleblowers had experienced at least one negative consequence as a result of acting. In fact, I think the young woman who uncovered the fraud in cancer research, she did actually finish her degree, but she was never able to find a job in her field. She ended up doing a service-type job somewhere else. So she definitely experienced negative consequences for uncovering that misconduct there. And apparently 90% of whistleblowers who did not have a negative experience said that they would do it again, but only 75% of people who had encountered negative consequences said that they would report it again if they had to do it over again. So I took a look at U of A's policies on research and scholarship integrity. There's quite a long document. There's the source for it, and I just reproduced a little bit of it. Most of these guidelines are to do with, not plagiarizing your results and not putting people's names on articles who didn't contribute in any way to it. So it's pretty standard stuff, but U of A does have a policy. And this is interesting. I thought there's certain journals and associations are really taking on this whole issue and finding solutions for themselves. I was at a workshop run by an editor for the American Society of Chemists for one of their journals, and they said that they have a program that they run on all submissions to the journal, and they look for plagiarized sections, and if anything comes back as having been published somewhere else or being seen before, then the submission is rejected, and actually the author is barred from further publication with that journal. So this is one way that they're trying to head off people publishing the same article with minor changes in in other journals. Okay, so a few questions for discussion. I think the most important thing is, well, for me anyways, an important aspect is the implications for society from fraudulent work, but also the other people who are involved. So if you have any ideas to offer, or if you have questions too.
So one way to look at the impact of education is, does it change human behavior? And although some of what we've talked about today probably wasn't very much fun to think about, it has greater possibility of actually changing what we do than a lot of the other things. Because many of the things we talk about in this course are extremely theoretical and have to do with, the distant future. What we talked about today could actually, impact on what we ourselves do in the future. So I think it was a very important and very valuable session, even though it wasn't 100% fun.
Excuse me, I thought you asked me to educate, not entertain.
Yes, that's right, and I did, and you did
and
it very well.
Sorry.
You succeeded. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Our time is up.